up. Hello, everybody, one and all. Welcome to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast. My name is Charles, and with me today, as always, is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend, Charles.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend as well, Dylan. And not just any fantasy, because today we are breaking new ground here on the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast. We are talking about our first graphic novel series ever on the show.
Right? We're talking about the wonderful Monstress comics by Marjorie Liu and Sana Takeda. And I've read through now the first four volumes, but we'll just be talking about the first volume here. That's volume 1, Awakening. And Charles, you just read through volume 1 for the first time.
That's right. Well,
so I'm excited.
It had been recommended to you through our Twitter account. Someone had mentioned it to you, and
Beth Tabler,
right, shout out. And you had read it, and then all of a sudden you're like talking to all these people about it, and you're all talking about how great it is. I'm like, what the heck? No one's told me about this. Dylan's gone off and had his own fun little chat, and I'm like sitting here by myself. So, not to be outdone, I went out and got book 1, this lovely massive tome, this work of art here. And we decided, hey, you guys were liking it so much, you were going off having a conversation. Well, and I joined the conversation, and let's make an episode. So I did read volume 1, those first 6 issues or chapters as they're called in Monstress, and I'm excited to talk about them today.
Right, and our longtime listeners will know that this is a theme. Every time I pick up a new book, or I guess in this case, comic that's not being covered on the show, Charles gets jealous promptly. And then before you know it, he's reading it too, and we're covering on the show. But I'm excited.
Yes, well, Dylan goes rogue, and then, being in charge of social media, he starts the dialogue, publicly. And I'm over here, I'm like, no one's telling me this is what we're doing. So I have to catch up. But you know what? Dylan's got his pulse on what's hot, and I'm just thankful that I'm able to at least stay in the loop every once in a while.
Right. This bad boy's won a lot of awards, and I think it's very well deserved. Here at the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast, we enjoy reading comics, but we have just read a lot more novels, you and I, Charles, than we have comics. We're pretty much we've read Saga, which we've talked about a few times on this show, and now we've read at least volume 1 of Monstress. But we're just not particularly well read when it comes to comics. So we're excited to enter that conversation. And Charles, my first thought of what makes sense to talk about here are just reactions to reading a graphic novel or a comic instead of reading a novel.
Well, it's when we wrote like our show description back in the day for Friends Talking Fantasy, we were like books, shows, movies, and more. And it's like we've done one TV show with Witcher, and then it's all been books. So I'm happy that we're getting into the and more category. I'm a big graphic novels fan. I've read a bunch of them over my lifetime. And I love going to my local comic shops, and I'm a big volumes guy, so I don't really stick around for the issues, but so I'm very excited. And what attracted me to Monstress right away, beyond like the conversations that were going on Twitter and Instagram also, was like the artwork of this, all the awards, obviously, like so much praise, and it's a high fantasy series, as well. And it's like, what a great way to kind of get into this. So for the show, I really like it. And it's something manageable that we can do in between our buddy reads as well. So we can get lots of content out every week and not feel like we have to just spend all of our off air time reading. So I think it's great. And I hope the fans enjoy it as well.
Me too, Charles. So you mentioned a sort of epic fantasy feel. I don't know if epic is the word that comes to mind for me. It feels much more grimdark with the setting, and there's even these steampunk elements to
Right.
Monstress. And by the way, we'll be spoiling up through volume 1 of Monstress in here, but we won't go beyond that. So if you haven't yet picked up Monstress, then Charles and I recommend you do, but we
Yep.
also recommend that you turn this down in your headphones if you don't want to hear any spoilers for volume 1.
Yes.
So yeah, Charles, I I too am struck by the artwork. I think it very much matches with this sort of grim, dark, gritty setting, right? Something about how detailed the art is makes it feel grittier, I guess, more realistic than you'd expect from a typical comic. And I'd say the world attempts to be more realistic in terms of the consequences and death and all of this kind of stuff that maybe we've come to expect from more of the grimdark genre when we've read fantasy novels.
Yeah, I would agree. And I would say, I would say maybe it's like a grimdark first, but I considered it high fantasy just because of like how
Oh, yes, you said
expansive
high.
the world is and how many, there's like 5 different like common races and there's all these different political factions and there's all these different characters and there's all kinds of magic stuff and gods and that even gets down to just the art style as well and how detailed it is. It mirrors the
Right.
detail of the story in a really amazing, interesting way. So that's why I was like, okay, maybe it's a combination of grimdark, some steampunk elements, and like it's got this high fantasy when it comes to its world building. I would say very much like a vast, huge, as big as any of the big fantasy series that we've read on the show. It's massive.
That's well said, Charles. And for some reason I thought you said epic, not high, but
Oh, maybe I
I
don't
think you
remember.
did say high. And I think yeah, high fantasy sometimes in my head that brings about this like Lord of the Rings type stuff, but I think you're right in the sense of having so many different, I guess, races. I don't know if that's the word used in
There's
different peoples.
the end of one of the volumes. I think calls it 5 like races. I want to say.
Fair. All right. Well, if they call it
You know.
races, I'll
Oh yeah,
hold to it.
races
And
of the known
then
world. Yeah, humans,
the
ancients, cats, the old gods, and arcanic half breeds. They're called races.
right. So yeah, a bunch of different races. I believe you, Charles. You don't have to hold it up. There's a bunch of different races in here. There's a bunch of different like beings that may or may not be gods or monsters. So a lot of that going on, and there's a lot of world building that happens in just this first volume. A lot to sink your teeth into if you're a fan of some of those more expansive series in fantasy.
Right, and much like a fantasy series, I open the cover and there's a detailed map, much like any other fantasy book, and then, the issue itself is like a double or triple size compared to most issues that are commonly released for a new series. So right away, you're definitely getting those fantasy vibes from a more traditional book, and the experience of reading it was very much like reading any of our fantasy uh, series as well. I was very impressed with the writing style and the way it just flowed. And even though there's a lot of complicated stuff going on, we're able to see it and it's presented in a way that we can keep moving and get all the necessary details without being weighted down by heavy descriptions that you might find in a novel or something. This book just keeps moving at a very dedicated pace, and a lot of that is the art style and the way the panels flow in the comic that makes it really digestible as well.
Totally agree, Charles. And there's all sorts of interesting things to this world, almost quirky building elements.
Yeah.
Like you've got talking cats, and it's not something that in the setting people are surprised to see. It's just something that they're one of those 5 races that you mentioned, Charles. Is oh yeah, there's cats, of course, and while there's other animals, those aren't treated in the same way that cats are. Those are treated oftentimes in more quintessential, like this is an animal. I think there's like hyenas relatively early on,
Right.
and they're just kind of normal hyenas. And cats, there are some cats that are just kind of normal and say meow, and then there's other cats with a lot more going on and
Eye
more...
patches and swords and double tails and things like that.
Right. Anthropomorphic.
Yeah.
Cats.
Hey, nice use of the word, Dylan.
Thank you. That's a word that, I have a sordid history with, but here we go. I think I nailed it that time.
Definitely.
So, yeah, and other things like unicorns in there, but they're just kind of treated like normal horses.
Yeah.
And there's an amazing moment that sticks out to me.
I know which one you're talking about.
Yeah, she freaking rips off a unicorn's horn and spears someone with
but
it.
It's told where it's like the guards are
like...
watching this unicorn run by. It's like, oh man, the horn's missing.
Yeah.
And then the next panel, all of a sudden they get pierced by it, like it gets thrown through their body. It was a funny way of being like, where's that unicorn's horn? And then they're killed with it.
Yeah, and I think that moment kind of encompasses part of what makes Monstress so great is the meeting of those more high fantasy elements like you were talking about, Charles, with a grimdark setting where it's like typically if you're seeing unicorns or things like that, then it's a little more likely to be this old-fashioned high fantasy feel where like no one would ever think in Lord of the Rings to snap off a unicorn's horn and then try to spear someone with it, because that's such a horrible, gritty, dark fantasy type thing to happen. Meanwhile, Monstress has those like elements in it with things like unicorns, but the setting is so dark and the characters are so morally gray and all that, including our main character, Micah, where look, this thing has a horn. Why wouldn't I try to use that to spear someone and kill soldiers with? And I think that's just so much of the charm of this comic.
Right. I think what the conversation we're kind of getting into, where it's like, how successfully are we blending grimdark and high fantasy, is an interesting one, because I think that's what makes Monstress's positioning in the world of fantasy so interesting. It's like, because we like grimdark, but grimdark's usually like subverting high fantasy and like more buying into just like these horrible realities, a little more violent. And then high fantasy has none of that typically, like none of these grimdark elements at all. And Monstress kind of brings the two together, both in its art style and in the story. You have, like you said, unicorns, but they're being, mistreated and they're breaking horns off and being used as weapons. You have people that are being held captive to be like consumed piece by piece for food and for energy, which is really grim and horrific and violent. And you also have like one of the main themes of this book, which is that it is rather hopeful when it comes down to it. And some of these characters are holding on to certain elements of hope. And it is a bit more, even though it's in a world that's 100% grimdark, I think the main character, Micah, and some other characters are trying to wade through that and try and, they're hopeful that they can learn more about themselves and be at peace and all that other stuff. So it's a really interesting blend, both thematically and in the art style, that where it has those glimmers of hope throughout, even though it's like horrifically violent and depressing as well.
That's well said, Charles, because I think we typically characterize grimdark as being made up of hopelessness. And
Hmm.
while the setting of this feels very grimdark, the characters and their reactions to it and some of the plot elements manage to give you that glimmer of hope like you're talking about, Charles. And I think it's it's a kind of thing where it differs from some of what we typically think of with grimdark. We think of people like Joe Abercrombie in his First Law series, which we're buddy reading right now, and people often have a very hard time in First Law latching on to characters that are in terms of their heroic traits, right? Like we
Right.
latch onto characters because they're awesome and well written in that series, but we don't latch onto them and root for them in the way that we might in other uh, more typical heroic characters in non-grimdark settings. So I think that the an interesting thing about Monstress and something that sticks out, especially after having read a lot of grimdark fantasy, are these characters like Little Fox or Kippa,
Yeah, I love Little
who
Fox.
actually, yeah, sticks out. Actually, my favorite character
Me too.
in this. That's yeah. I thought maybe I'd surprise you with that one
That is
because
kind of surprising that he's your favorite.
she,
She's your favorite, but it's not too surprising because the character does stand out so well, both in terms of like, we're talking about that hope aspect as a theme. And I think a lot of the innocence of Little Fox as a character is a huge part of that driving force for Micah. Sometimes Little Fox keeps Micah grounded in certain moments.
mhm.
And so I think trying to protect that innocence is an interesting part of this overall theme of hope. And then her art style of Little Fox too, it like the a lot of the color choices for Monstress are very dark, right? And
Yes.
it's brilliantly shaded. Like what she can do with the colors like black, gray, and brown are amazing in this. But Little
Right.
Fox is always this light beacon of orangey yellow, right, and white, and
Wearing a light blue
yeah, always
a lot
well
of the
lit. She
times.
has these more anime eyes that are much bigger, and she's
Hmm.
very expressive. She's always hugging, clutching onto her tail, which is
Yeah.
such a great look for the character. Like barely hanging on to, like trying to survive in this horrible, horrible world, but being like, what would an
Hmm.
innocent character in this kind of world? How would they cope? And you can see she's like barely holding on, but still holding on, and that's important. And that's why I think Little Fox is such a strong character that kind of your eyes go to and your attention goes to and is always fun to read because she is kind of that beacon of hope in this story.
Yeah, Lil Fox is so brilliant in this book because that's why I was starting to evoke Joe Abercrombie, Lord Grimdark, because especially in the first Law series, all characters are amazing, but none of them are heroes, and none of them just lean all in on that.
Hmm.
And I think it mirrors kind of the place we were talking about with the plot and the setting and stuff like that, where Monstrous stands between grimdark and high fantasy in its willingness to say, well, maybe there are some characters that are really heroic and in these ways that might be perceived as naive
Hmm.
by in the works of like Joe Abercrombie, or even would be potentially deadly in Game of Thrones to
Yeah.
hold those kind of right.
Right.
All those subvert your typical heroic traits, and this almost seems to start moving back
Yeah.
toward like, well, okay, what if there's a character that they are kind of naive, quote unquote, in the sense that they're young and all that, but they have experienced all of this hardship that Little Fox has. And despite all of that, they say, I'd rather go down for my values and the things that are really important, like loyalty, like friendship, all this stuff. And I'd like to try to be a hero, even if I don't have the strength to, and even if the world doesn't want me to. And if I kind of if I die, I die. It feels like at times with Little Fox, like she'll be toward the end. She was like ready to fight it's the Mother Superior
Yeah.
who that was a huge mismatch there, Charles.
Yeah.
But she would have gone down fighting, and you got Master Ren kind of like. Ubati, save us. That's the cat god. And it's like, well, she's going to go for it. And you don't see a lot of those characters in a grimdark setting, Charles. And that's what
Very
sticks
true.
out to me so much about Lil Fox or Kippa.
Yeah, that's a great way of trying to find its place in the world of grimdark fantasy compared to Game of Thrones and to Lord Grimdark himself. I think that idea of maintaining hopefulness in the most grim dark of settings is a really interesting position, and that's why I kept going back to that high fantasy element at the beginning, because you in this world it's so dark and depressing, and you have things like body horror, slavery, war, very graphic violence, like corruption of innocence, all of these horrible elements. And anyone squeamish to violence should steer clear from this series, because right in the beginning
Yes.
we're like torturing children, and like what's so interesting about reading this in a graphic novel setting is there's just a setting where a noblewoman's going through her chambers, and there's just a child missing limbs, like in total
Hmm.
fear, and it's implied. All the implication of the horror of that is what even adds another element of horror. It's like we're just looking at that. It's not explained. In a novel, you'd have to be like, there was a child in a cage in the corner, missing limbs. But in a graphic novel setting, you just see it. And the fact you're processing it for yourself adds another element to the horror element of it. And it's really quite disturbing, but it's what makes it buy into that grimdark setting so well. And it builds into the world building as well, of like, the fine line between a person and a resource is an interesting one as well.
Yeah. So, Charles, what's very interesting about this series for us as the FTF podcast is it's inspired, it seems like, by a lot of similar events to what the Poppy War trilogy is inspired by. So if you
Sure.
check out the like I don't know if I'd call it the last page, but it's literally the back cover, but the inside of it of the first vol. Oh, maybe you don't have it because you have the book. I don't know if it does this,
All the
but
illustrations are
in
in
my
it, but I don't know if it's going to be in the same spot.
no, it's a blurb from Marjorie Liu about the inspiration of the
Oh.
series, and it's inspired by so her grandparents, as she said, experienced the devastation of war firsthand in China, and talks about like what ravaged Europe during World War II, also ravaged China and the rest of Asia. So the kind of stuff that we already have seen a grimdark setting explore in the Poppy War, but Marjorie Liu goes on to say in this blurb, uh, and the root of my desire, I finally realized, was to tell a story about what it means to be a survivor. A survivor not just of a cataclysmic war, but of racial conflict and its antecedent, hatred. And to confront the question, how does one whom history has made a monster escape her monstrosity? How does one overcome the monstrousness of others without succumbing to a rising monstrousness within? And I think I mean,
Great
that's the
questions.
author, right? That's what she's looking to explore here. And I think I've not really read anything else like it that explores those questions through characters that are all across the map regarding how heroic they are and how they deal with the grimdark setting.
Right, and there's some interesting parallels that can be made between this and the Poppy War series as well, especially with the main characters and this idea of all kinds of other things that are going on. I don't want to get too much detail
No,
into Poppy War, but
no spoilers.
no spoilers in this episode for Poppy War. But there are lots of interesting parallels. One of them being the inspiration, and I did find the foreword you're talking about. It's in the back of this book, so I did not read it before
Okay.
this, but it is here. for any of you considering buying like book one, this giant, massive hardcover thing, it is in there. So, yeah, it's those are great questions and great inspiration for this book, and it makes sense because Micah is pretty much bought in that she's beyond like saving at many times, and like worse and worse things keep happening to her, but she hits a point at some point in the first volume where she's like, even though all this stuff happens, I finally am starting to feel hope for the first time. And so you
Yes.
can see that she's struggling with those themes right in this first volume, and that's what has kept me so intrigued and brought into this. One, there's this mystery of her origin that's you want to puzzle out and you want to get to the bottom of. But two, it's just like we were talking about, this interesting balance between like the buy-in of this being a fantasy book combined with very modern, um, body horror, grim dark stuff, and how we're kind of balancing those two in a way that's like super honest and believable and makes for great characterization that we haven't seen in some of the other grim dark series that we've read.
Right. And it's a kind of thing where if you do look at these tragedies and genocides and things like that in history, there are heroic stories that emerge.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's why it's like in some ways it's more realistic to tell a story in a grimdark setting where there are still people striving so hard to do the right thing. So I like that a lot. And you bring up Micah, Charles, which makes sense given she's the main character. And I think she's so interesting in her moral grayness, part that sticks out to me, especially contrasted with Little Fox, who gets to be kind of angel on her shoulder a lot of the times. Right. And there's a moment it's on page 157 in my volume anyway, and Little Fox says to Micah, he's an organic miss, he must be safe. And Micah says, am I safe, Little Fox? And Little Fox says, I think you try to be, you're just not very good at it. And Micah says, no, I'm not.
Oh yeah.
And that has stuck out to me so much as characterizing who Micah is, especially, but also Little Fox, where it's like Micah, you can tell she really does want to do the right thing when she gets the opportunity, but she's more pragmatic about how messed up this world is than someone like Little Fox.
Sure.
And she's got more strength, obviously. She's very strong, and more ability to actually enact things into the world than I think Little Fox does here. And lastly, she's got a freaking monster inside of her that is urging her to feed on other intelligent beings, and she has to grapple with, okay, well, I kind of am going to have to, I guess, appease this monster to some extent, but I also don't want to go too far overboard. Like, she would do anything in her power. Like she said, at one point she would kill herself before she would let the monster eat Little
Right.
Fox. So it's like, okay, well, I'm going to concede maybe this wounded soldier that's walking around, but you're not touching Kippa.
Right. And there's also what's interesting about this scene that you brought up is the fact that Little Fox is acknowledging these aspects. I think that's very important because it's like how much of this is just Little Fox just clinging to whoever's paying attention to them. But this moment she's like, you're trying and you're not very good at it, but I'm with you anyway. Like, you've tried to eat me once already, and like I've seen you do horrible things to other people, including eating them and like murdering people, and I've seen all kinds of horrible violence, but I see that you're trying, and that is enough for me. And that's a very sweet moment. And I also want to give props to the art design in these scenes. Like we mentioned earlier, so many of this is like a really dark palette, some browns and greens, but mostly blacks. And in this scene, for all you listeners at 157, is very well lit and very bright. You have this bright blue light from must be either the moon or like these fireflies that are around. And her face is well lit up. You get a close up, and
Hmm.
it's a dedicated panel just of Little Fox being like, "You try to be," and I
Yes.
think that's very important as well. I think the scene, this is that hopefulness we're talking about. This is like a big thematic point of that, where Little Fox, I think for one of the first times, is accepting Micah, like
Hmm.
outwardly being like, "You try to be, and I'm still with you. Yeah, I still love you for that." And I think that's a really important scene.
It is, Charles, and I love what you bring up there about trying,
Hmm.
and the word try is the single word in bold in that panel as
Right.
well. So I think that's the key, and it does correspond to this theme of, look, if you're in a world like this, horrible things are going to happen. You might do horrible things, but it's about trying to do right, trying to do your best. And Little Fox reminds us of that so well in that brightly lit panel, Charles.
That's very well said, Dylan. That theme of trying to be good, and then the theme of hope go hand in hand here, and they're very brilliantly balanced with the art direction here as well. Great, great moment you picked out for us.
Oh, thanks, Charles. So I want to explore some some other great moments
Hmm.
in this book. This is our first time really talking about
That's
it.
right.
So, uh, part of what I want to hear about is how you, Charles, feel about the when the monster emerges, and when we find out then later that Micah, she comes out with the blue-haired boy and Little Fox, and she wakes up to find out, like, well, okay, I did eat one of them.
Oh yeah.
Um, like, how are you reacting to some of those early moments with the monster emerging?
You know, there's throughout Monstress, what kind of keeps you going and keeps you curious are these elements of mystery. And this was just another layer to that. Like, we don't know, like, we've seen a little bit at this point of this monster that takes over, but we haven't seen like that level of atrocity, I guess you would say, where it eats an innocent child, and she's
Right.
subconscious the whole time. And it was very dark and grim, and the way it was presented was an interesting one where they're like, "Oh yeah, you ate him, he's gone." And they're like still trudging on, and she's like, "What? I don't even remember that."
Yep.
So, and then it just cuts to a panel of the poor kid's like shriveled up corpse, and it's like, "Oh man, this is
Yeah.
intense." So I was like, okay, there's some stakes here. Like, she's capable of doing horrific things and not even realizing it. And at what level does she have control? When does the monster take over? Like, those kind of elements are very important, and we're still trying to piece them together. But we know that she's capable of doing like the most
Yes.
horrible, unspeakable acts. And that kind of raises the stakes for us. Like, she's basically like a ticking time bomb in that cart.
Well said, Charles. That's kind of what I was hoping to tee you up for. Is that's the moment for me where I'm like, okay, we're not pulling any punches
Yeah.
here, because I guess you could easily think, oh, this is the little trio, is her and these two kiddos,
Yeah.
and then before you know it, like off screen, she's eaten one of them,
Right.
and it's like, oh, like, I guess this isn't going to be one of those morally great characters who like actually never does
Yeah, they have
anything
a hard line
wrong.
that they never cross.
It's like, well, yeah, maybe she was unconscious, but she did the thing. And I think that's what we watch Micah grapple with. It's more subtext than it is right in the forefront, but of like what her responsibility is, given the fact that this monster
Hmm.
is inside of her. Like, she's putting herself in these situations, she's surrounding herself with these people, and to some extent it is on her when these things happen, and she seems to be aware of
Right.
that.
And she may not have known that that's what she was capable of at that point, because later
Yeah.
on, like we already discussed about, she's like, I will kill myself before letting something like that happen again to little Fox. So she's taking some agency over it, but she's the thing she's capable of, and to what level she's responsible, because she does try and work with this monster inside her, and does try to use its power to get them out of certain situations, and they're starting to develop an understanding. And that's kind of how this volume ends, where they're like the monster and Micah are more on the same page. They both can, like, we can help each other out, we can give each other what we want to know, and they're coming more to an agreement, and they're being able to be more controlled about what they do. And we don't know exactly how dangerous that is, and like, is she playing with fire, is she accepting more responsibility for these horrible actions that she's potentially able to commit. So that's all getting built up here, and it's an interesting dynamic as well.
That it is, Charles. So another thing I want to run by you
Mm-hmm.
is what what do you feel about the like the talking cats and all like those more quirky elements of the setting? I'll let you go.
Sure. So, I mean, there's definitely some anime inspired vibes in this series. I often get some of the character designs, I get very like Final Fantasy vibes. And
Yeah,
I think,
like the airship, steampunk stuff.
yeah,
Yeah.
there's the airship stuff. Like sometimes the characters' hairstyles and all the armor, and like just
Yeah.
the vast attention to detail and all the illustrations, all the line work that's done is very intricate and detailed to the finest level. And you get a lot of those moments. Also, a part of what I feel like comes with anime and with graphic novels sometimes is the opportunity to be a little more quirky with things like cat. Like, who doesn't love a cute cat, you know? So you get these
Hmm.
moments of like, oh, this is a cat with an eye patch, and then like every issue ends with like the cat school, and the cat's teaching all the other
Yes,
cats, and that's how you.
Professor Tam
Yes,
Tam.
Professor Tan. So it adds an element of charm to an otherwise grimdark thing. It's almost like comic relief without having comic relief. Um, so I think it's fun, and it's, you can see, I guess, the artist and the authors kind of influence and like having fun with their own world, and I'm always happy to see that. And there are elements of it sometimes that I find kind of, funny and interesting. So I'm all for it. It's a nice palate cleanser between all the like horrible stuff we have to go through in this world.
Right. I think it's really interesting, and it does a good job of creating that juxtaposition, which I think is
Right.
the theme of our episode at this point, and the theme of Monstress in a lot of ways, which is I think of a moment where the monster is coming out trying to eat little Fox. Micah's telling her to run, and Micah's curled up, and she's like, I am not a monster. She's like mumbling that to
Yeah.
herself while she's losing consciousness. And then we get this moment where Master Ren, the cat, is watching on. And I have to try to keep our clean rating here, Charles.
Yes.
So I'm going to do a little paraphrasing, but it's, he says, to quote the poets, we're effed.
Yeah.
And I'm like, it's like a funny moment. It's obviously grim in what it implies, and we get the sense that the cats are sage in some ways, like
Right.
they're wise in
They're
some
the
ways.
oldest race
But
and everything like that.
yes, exactly. And like, it's also funny just seeing this cat, especially early on, where you're still not completely familiar with these world elements,
Right.
to see this cat looking on, and he's quoting the poets and cursing
Yeah.
is it's all
Yeah, and he seems
like
to be kind of
this.
more knowing than we are about what's happening
Yes.
as well. So there is that, like you said, wise element to it. Yeah, I think, um, like you said, the kind of the word of the day on this episode is that hopefulness, that juxtaposition of it with the grimdark. And
Yeah.
I think having these like humorous moments is part of building up that hopefulness. Like, hey, there are parts of this world that are cute and cuddly and funny, like we are still able to have those moments, and we might be able to pull out of this at some point, like you don't, it's never actually explicitly said, but the fact that those kind of elements do exist, like little fox and cute cats and things like that, it's like, okay, and humor, it's like, okay, like there might be hope for this world after all. It's not just 100% like gone. There is those glimmers. So I think they balance it well. It's not a funny series by any means, but they do pepper in these more
Well,
fun
it's not
elements.
designed to be primarily humorous. It is funny,
Yeah,
I think it's fair to say.
So I think that's all part of its glimmer of hope aspect of it. I think you need those moments where it might not have a place in Game of Thrones or something like that. It certainly has a place in Monstress.
Exactly. Yeah, another one of those funny moments that sticks out to me is when Micah is having a conversation with Little Fox and they're riding a unicorn and they're kind of just talking about, okay, what are we going to do next? At one point, Little Fox just kind of notes, you shouldn't eat people.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a pretty good instinct there, I would think.
Yeah.
You think she would draw? You think Micah would draw the line at eating kids, but she had a few slip ups.
Yeah, it happens. So, I mean, another thing that I think one of the more interesting characters, and we don't get a ton yet, is Master Ren, Charles. And I don't know, right? The three characters probably of most import or interest are Micah, Lil Fox, and Master Ren, the cat.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we owe Master Ren a little bit of discussion. What are your reactions to Master Ren so far? Obviously, there are some things going on behind the scenes where he
Right.
kind of betrayed them, but then he went back with when Lil Fox, the moral compass for everyone, it kind of brings him back into things.
Right.
So, what do you think?
I think Ren is one of those characters where they're not showing all their cards, so we don't know
Right.
where their allegiances lie, where their where what they're trying to accomplish, like what's their own self-interest. You don't really know why Master Ren is hanging around with them so much and what the interest is. He seems to think Micah's obviously dangerous. It's like, oh man, she tapped into this power, she's escaped, we're all doomed. So at what is his purpose there, and what is he trying to accomplish? We don't really know. So he's kind of a suspicious character, but you do see he has these moments where he does care about protecting the innocence of Little Fox many times. He does have those like charming elements about him. So maybe, maybe some cracks are starting to show, like we don't really know, but jury's still out on him. But I think it's an interesting dynamic. It adds to that level of intrigue, right? It's like, what do they know? What's the secret behind, like, what his involvement is, what their stakes are. It's another piece of the suspense and the mystery of Monstress that has been driving the plot forward this whole time, of like Micah's true nature and like what really happened and what's all this about. We're still piecing that together, and Master Ren seems to know more than we have been shown at this point.
That much is clear, Charles. Yeah, I like Master Ren a lot and his dynamic with both of the other characters in their little trio here, where he's pragmatic enough to obviously see a lot of the danger in Micah and maybe not look on her with the same level of hopefulness that Kippa might,
Right.
but then again, he is sentimental enough where when it comes down to it with Little Fox, like he cares a lot. At least we've seen that much. So there's a lot more I think to find out, and I'm ahead, so I don't want to spoil anything there. The Another topic that I think is worth discussion, Charles, is there's a lot being thrown at us
Hmm.
in this first volume. There's a lot of different factions. There's a lot of different characters. The Dawn Court, the Dusk Court, the Ancients. The All these things are going on. Did you have a hard time following? Easy time following? What was that like?
Well, it's an interesting experience because I don't feel like I just have all the knowledge of the whole world, but when I'm reading, I'm okay. Like I feel like, I see certain groups up enter the scene and I know what's going on and I get a sense for the scene and who's on what side and all of that. But if you ask me to like sit down and write everything you know about the world building of Monstress, I'd be like, oh man, it's kind of a lot. I don't think I know as much as I maybe it has been presented. But kind of like we were talking about earlier, it's like the way it's written and what we're shown makes it very easy to follow the plot and follow. It's like, I know that group, right? The group with that
Yeah,
armor, I know who they are, and I know they're against the
exactly.
group with that armor, or, this group is treated differently or has different skin tones or styles. So I know that to be the case. So um, as I'm reading, I feel like I know everything I need to, but there is a lot going on. There is a lot to piece out, but it never feels overwhelming, even if I'm not like 100% knowledgeable. I think you're just meant to kind of go with it and just recognize the artistic tells between each character to know what you need to know.
Mm, I like that artistic tells,
Yes.
Charles. Yeah. So when we were when we were preparing for this episode, Charles and I were discussing how a lot of the benefit of being able to follow what's going on is how great the art is
Mhm.
and how a picture says 1,000 words or whatever they say. These pictures are saying a lot of the words for us and help us follow it. It's The visual medium is used so well, and it sticks out to me so much as someone who usually reads these long fantasy novels that have no pictures
Yeah.
or anything. So to say 1,000 words, they have to use 1,000 words.
Right.
So yeah, it's really interesting because there's a lot of these moments of like, oh yeah, them. Like early on, you're looking at a group that looks a certain way. You're like, okay, yeah, these folks. But then for recording a podcast, you have to be able to be like, oh, the Inquisitrixes,
Right.
which was a word I don't know if I I was following that word applied to that group of people that well when I was first reading it, but I knew when I saw them.
Right.
So that's credit to Sana Takeda
Right,
for
there's so much
these
intricate
amazing
detail in all the
illustrations.
different like armors and settings and different kinds of magic systems going on. Like there's so much intricate detail that it's very easy to tell them all apart and to believe them and buy into them and recognize them when they come up again. So, yeah, just an achievement in the art style here for sure.
That it is. Yeah, I mean, we have the stage thoroughly set by the time we're closing out this volume. We've got a lot of intrigue. There's things like obviously Micah has this childhood friend named Tuya,
Mhm.
and she's basically looking for Tuya the whole time to one extent or another.
Kind of.
And yeah, maybe it's not fair to say she's looking for her the whole time,
I think
but
she
she's
like
looking
she
for her at
knowingly
points.
left Tuya to uncover mysteries about herself, right? And she wants to get
Yes, that's
back. She
fair.
wants to get back to Tuya, but she's prioritizing her own, like solving her own mysteries, I would say.
That is very fair, Charles. The book is more about finding out things about her than it
Because
is
Tuya
getting back
tried
to
to
Tuya.
talk her out of a whole lot of these plans that she's been involved in, and Micah's like, well, I have to know. I can't not do it. I need to know the information. And Tuya's like, why? Why? We got a good thing going here. And Micah's like, I just have to know. So, that's kind of a little bit of a rift that we started to see at the beginning of this book, this volume.
Well said. So that rift forms, Micah leaves, but there's a plan to get back to Tuya.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't work out, and then she's kind of back to, let me try to find out what's going on with me, because who knows where Tuya is at this point.
Right.
But she's being led places by people who are supposedly associated. Like Master Ren is like, oh, Tuya sent me, and Corvin is like, oh, now I'm here. So the point being, Charles, we're left here toward the end with a reveal that Tuya is the Baroness, who's one of the people who worked to lock Micah up in that sarcophagus to try to render her powerless, which didn't really work.
Right.
And I'm wondering, like, what do you think of that through line? Like, are you intrigued? Did you think it was well done? That kind of stuff with Tuya.
I am intrigued. I'm wondering, like, is there more backstory between Tuya and Micah that I don't know? Because, like, if they were as friendly as they are, why are there so many secrets? That's kind of the thing that I'm still trying to puzzle out, that I'm hoping Volume 2 will get a little more into, because it seems like by the end of the first volume, it's clear now that there is some stuff unsaid between them, and Tuya is trying to like behind the scenes get in contact with Micah and influence Micah's quest and all of that. So it's like, why isn't she just talking to her directly? Like, they're friends and they're trying to get back to each other. So what's the holdup, and why all of the secrets? So that's something I haven't quite mastered the understanding of yet, but it's certainly, I think that's intentional, right? To deliberately end volume 1 with that little cliffhanger piece. It's like,
For sure.
the plot thickens, guys. You'll have to read the next issue to figure out what's going on here. So I'm intrigued. I'm not enough pieces are there for me to understand why this is the way it is. So I'm sure that we're gonna get a lot more details, and I'm sure the plot will continue to thicken and get messier before volume 2 is over. So it's interesting. I'm intrigued. I'm just trying to piece it together, because they seem so friendly. It's like, that's the closest thing to family that they have, and just trying to piece out, why aren't they in more direct communication? Like, why aren't they on the same page?
Exactly. And I think that's so much of what this series is about, is raising all of these questions and mysteries about the characters, their backgrounds,
Mm-hmm.
their intentions, their futures, in the sense of, there's even talk of prophecies around what Micah is supposed to be doing.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so many more questions than there are answers, and as you'd expect in volume 1 of something that I think is supposed to go on for a while. I really don't know. I've only read the first 4 volumes. I think 5
There's
are available.
5
but
published, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm still trying to piece together everything that's out there as I read the 5th one.
Mm-hmm.
But it's really, really raising questions, and I think the questions are what keep us reading, and they're what keeps Micah moving.
Sure, it's a lot of these mysteries and things that is what's driving the plot. I mean, since the beginning, it's like, what is the secret origin behind Micah's, lineage and family, and her powers, and the god that's possessing her? Is like so many interesting different pieces that we are all trying to puzzle out, and everyone has such an invested interest on every side, every race, and you're still trying to piece together.
Everyone wants a piece of Micah.
Yeah, right. And so you're trying to figure out why still, and getting back to those high fantasy elements, like very intricate, more and more and more stuff getting piled on, and it's a lot to dive into, and that's part of the experience of reading and what makes it so fun, right? There's a lot to really sink your teeth into here, and yeah, it's just left you wanting more and leaves you with more questions, and it sets up this expansive world that we have at least 4 more volumes to issues, no volumes to get into.
Right. I mean, I'd seen people calling it. I can't find the quote right now, but like as ambitious as Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones and things like that. And it's certainly very ambitious in trying to set the stakes with tons of players in a massive game.
Right.
And I'm excited for us to continue to delve into how that game plays out.
And I
Charles.
think this has been a great transition for us from fantasy novels to graphic novels, because this is built and structured so much like a fantasy novel in terms of like the maps and the cultures and the worlds and the magic systems and the political factions and the settings and all of that. It's very, it's a fantasy series, so it's a welcomed smooth transition for us, and it's something that's masterfully done here. I'm just looking forward to seeing how the plot progresses at this point. Hopefully resolve some of these mysteries.
And I'm going to take that as a welcome, smooth transition toward our end of the episode.
I'm ready if you
that's
are.
Hopefully masterfully done. Well, we had an awesome time reading Volume 1 of Monstress and talking about it here. And if you like Monstress, you like us maybe, you like this episode, then there's plenty of places that you can reach out to us. You can reach out to us on Twitter at the FTF Podcast 1. You can also find us on Instagram or Facebook at the FTF Podcast. If you're the kind of person who likes sending emails to your favorite podcasters, then you're welcome to do that. You can reach us at the FTF Podcast at gmail.com. And it's possible that you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts. If that's the case, then what can they do to show their support, Charles?
Toss 5 stars to our podcast. Yes, if you have Apple Podcasts and that's where you're listening, go on over. I know it's, it's not the most convenient thing to like find our account, pull up the artist's name, scroll down, leave those 5 stars, and even more, write a review, which would be awesome. But even just leaving the 5 stars would mean so much to us. So if you did like it, what you heard, that's such a great way to support the show.
Well said, Charles.
Well said. Thank you all so much for listening. And as always, go forth and conquer, friends.